It's nice to see a very crowded room. So how many of you have been last year in my session? Good, because I will repeat a couple of those things, because I think that it's important. So my name is Tomás Zaborowski. Thank you for introducing me. I work for Bayer. I work in this industry for around 20 years. And I do not come from agriculture, but I also find that agriculture became my passion. And one thing that I will talk today is what it was our journey on understanding nature and how nature is connected to many things. So today everybody talks about climate. I don't know how many of you have discussed about carbon projects, carbon offsets in the networking session, but I guess that there will be many of you talking about that. I will try to talk more about what is going on, because with climate also comes nature. And in Bayer, for example, we have our purpose that it's called Health for All, Hunger for None. I come from the agricultural division, where we work in agriculture, trying to help farmers to move and transition into regenerative agriculture. And that's how I will explain a little bit of the journey. So I will start with addressing how 3-4 years ago, we sat down and said, where are the main challenges that we can help to solve and to contribute? And then also, what is the call today and the pressure that we have in becoming nature positive, not only big companies, but everybody? How this influences the ESG perspective, so the environmental, social, and governance, and how this creates value in talking a little bit around regenerative agriculture, and how do we see this approach. So starting by the beginning, I don't know how many of you know around the planetary boundaries, which is done by the Stockholm Resilience Center. But to summarize, today biodiversity loss exceeds the safe limit to 2.7 times what it can be consumed. So in this graph, that it's not self-explainable, but I would say that climate change, biodiversity, and many other topics are critical for humankind to survive. And while we are depleting the resources that we have on the environment, we're also finding that 1 billion people goes to bed hungry. Saying that, in the World Economic Forum, on the last, you see, in the next 2 years, main companies see that misinformation and disinformation, weather events, social polarization are the main topics. But if you move also to what these next 10 years will come, they're all connected to climate, or they're all connected to nature. And this is what it comprises 3 of the top, I would say 4 of the top listed main global risks that not only farmers will face, but the whole society. So how serious is the topic of biodiversity? According to the IPBES, today 1 million species of plants and animals are facing extinction. So what does this mean for us, particularly in our business? And what I like to address this is usually when we talk about these things, I like to talk about impacts, risks, and opportunities. And this also connects to many frameworks that you're already hearing, like CSRD, and all the different topics that we will need to develop to increase our transparency, to comply, but first of all, how we will need to transition our businesses. So for agriculture, this means that for today, for example, native species in most major land-based habitats has fallen around 20% since the 1900s. For example, 90% of all soils are expected to be degraded by 2050. Currently, land degradation already has reached a 23% decrease. Also, it is estimated that 10% of insects are being threatened. Many of the country reports decline in different populations. And 9 out of the 6,000 crop species account for 66% of all production. So our systems are not sustainable. So what is the call to action? And I like to picture in the concept of nature positive or nature positivity. This is something that it's been evolving, saying that we need to revert our depleting nature by 2030, reaching by 2050 and net zero. Does it sound, compared to climate? Climate and nature goes hand in hand. And this is the way that we see that nature needs to be restored, but on the other hand, we need to keep on producing, but we need to do it differently. We need to preserve. That's the main impact that we see. Today, for example, we see different coalitions forming in the topics of nature. One of them is Nature Positive, where different coalitions work on trying to achieve this transition and how different companies are going to need to bring change into the way that they use nature to produce, and also to identify different risks and opportunities. But what is the actual situation? So I mentioned climate a lot, and if in this survey done by McKinsey, you can see that 83% of the companies are already having an acknowledgement about climate, and also they have set a target with 83%. Without a target, then you reach up to 97%. But if you go to nature, then you see that only 5% have established different targets, but a lot of those companies are already being aware of the topic and that they need to integrate these type of topics into their strategy. So here, are we ready to take action? Well, this is one approach, but lots of things are evolving into the different sectors. What is the Global Biodiversity Framework with different targets that countries and companies will have to develop? This also reflects into different guidance and standards, like one that I'm going to mention today, like is TNFD, but even in CSRD, you have different regulations on how to disclose on nature. And of course, also we have financial institutions going into the same hurdle where they will have to start disclosing how their portfolios are connected to nature and what are the implications of the portfolio, but also companies. And I can say with most of the investors that I talk today, very concerned about ESG topics, I would say that 80 to 90%, they are coming to addressing how are we starting to interact with nature, and main pressure comes into that place. And of course, there is a lot of concern around customers, how we are creating our products, but also how employees are considered in how the companies that they're working on are working on that one. So we need to minimize disruption. We need to comply to regulatory requirements. We need to see how companies are going to proactively manage climate and nature as well, and also how we're going to benefit of being the early opportunities to move into that topic. Let me stop and bring you a little bit of the perspective of what's happening on ESG. One of the main topics is how do we start to rethink the approach, is to be aware of the topic. And how we can achieve this new way forward is if we can understand what we call the invisible risks that we have in interacting with nature. What does that mean? Usually, everybody knows about the problem that we have with data security, or everybody is more aware today about climate. But are we really aware on how we work with nature? What does that mean? Do we have concrete assessments on how our supply, or I would even say own operations, are interacting with nature? And it's not only about how we are, our building is connected to nature and if we have the flowers. No, it goes beyond. So for example, in our case, a great part of our activities also are driven by rivers. If rivers are not going to be flooded or dry, that could be a disruption of our business as well. So how we can start interpreting risk and opportunities in nature start to become real challenging as well. So what it had happened, so TCFD, how many of you know about TCFD? The Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures. This is a framework that will be very helpful for those that already know about it on how we're going to disclose for the climate transition adaptation plan of the CSRD. But in nature, there was a space that it was still empty. For that, TNFD is a task force for nature on financial disclosure. is a task force of companies, investors, financial institutions, NGOs, and different organizations that got together on starting to identify a framework that could help companies to disclose, but also be aware of the impact, opportunities, dependencies, and risks that they have on nature. This started in 2020 with around 40 individuals, as I mentioned, and the benefits for companies is that they will get an internal diagnostic on the interactions with nature, and investors that they can reduce the risk. You will find in the website, this was launched last year, and you will find lots of different information, e-learnings, and on how to work on this matter. But besides that, one of the main key aspects is that the way that we need to address nature is very different to climate. So when we talk about climate, what is the main metric? GHG, equivalent emissions. There is a greenhouse protocol. There is a lot of information. Key. How do we do this for nature? Well, there are 20,000 metrics. For each business could be completely different, and also is location-based. So the TNFD has developed an approach that is called the LEAP approach, that it goes into the locate phase, where you will have to identify the impacts and dependencies based on location. So in our case, we have 40,000 data points for the 1,060,000 sites that we have around the world, and that's only including our own operations. This also includes opportunity and risk that it will be on scope 3. So imagine interdependencies and impacts and risk and opportunities on your supply chain. It gets more complex. The LEAP approach has that locate phase. Then it's an evaluation phase where you will have to identify where you have your most impactful risk. And then you go into an assessment on how you're going to transform and then how you're going to disclose. Saying around that complexity, what it has been done, what is one of the main topics that we have on these kind of issues, is harmonization. So why do we have to do TCFD, TNFD, ISSB, CSRD, GRI? And I can continue until tomorrow, but I have only a few minutes. Saying that, the aim is starting to be on harmonization, and TNFD is working very diligently with ESRS on how to combine the different type of approaches, and that companies will find this space far much comprehensible. So I talk about a lot of different problems, but a way that we saw this interdependency with agriculture in Bayer, we found an opportunity that we call regenerative agriculture, because agriculture, as you can see, is one of the most impactful activities that we have in terms of biodiversity, forest loss, freshwater consumption, chemical and plastic pollution, fertilization. Agriculture, it's at the top. How many of you have heard about the concept regenerative agriculture? Not many? Well, for those that have not heard, there is a lot of noise out there in the market. Everybody talks about regenerative, everybody talks about transitioning, everybody's talking about how we should change the way that we do. And here we're not even talking about organic, we're talking about the way that we're going to produce in a different way. So besides this, that it sounds like a buzzword, there is a lot of component behind this. The main problem why there is a lot of buzzword is that there is not concrete definition. So today, for example, there is not a single consensus. And why is that? Because addressing each farmer is a complete different aspect. So it's a complete different reality. So if in nature, we're having these issues on how we're going to measure and track, when we want to implement regenerative agriculture, there is not a one consensus. So there are many different aspects. So there are many people working around that, and all has its own perception and interpretation. And almost actors, usually, they want to create their own terminology and their own methodology because that's how they steer their businesses. And although there is no a unique definition, what we have come to define are different aspects of different outcomes and principles that, regardless of the definitions, they're going to be the same. That is how we're going to restore what we are depleting. So how we can create the best certainty on this topic, it still remains a challenge. But before definitions, before regulations, sometimes when we talk about these type of things, we forget about the farmer. Because at the end, we as consumers demand that the food that we consume is safe, healthy, and that every time it's produced better. But who is behind that? And usually the farmer has been part of the initial part of the value chain. Then you find that it's the most forgotten. So you have lots of people in a very nice developed country creating 20,000 frameworks and certifications and ways of inspiring farmers on how they should transition. But most of them, they don't have, or they do not account that farmers have been doing this already for a long period of time. And this is a photograph that I love because it's a real photograph to show the evolution of what farmers have done since 1940 with different practices, principles, and introduction of technology into their fields. So the first plot that you can see is what it was needed in 1940 to produce 250 kilograms of yield of corn. That accounted for approximately 1,300 cubic metrics. If we move into 1980s with different incorporation of technologies, I'm not going to go into the specific, but for example, hybrids, you have seen how much land has already been saved. And then if we can continue with different integrations, we can see a future where for the same 250 kilograms of yield, you need 120 meters. But what do you see the difference between 2019 and the future? That it cannot be much more reduced. We will not see the same change that we have seen from the 1940 to the future. So the challenge that we have now in agriculture and in our interaction with nature is that we need to restore even the soil that we will still need to use. So what is our approach? And this is a way that we have defined our own principles. When we will approach different principles of practices like no tillage, like diversity of crop rotations, minimizing the soil disturbance, or optimizing inputs, there will be certain benefits that we have at the top of the ideas that the farmer will have to still count on yield, because when we talk about sustainability, we still talk about an economic, an environmental, and a social component. So yield should come first, but soil and soil regeneration should be at the core of the main outcomes. So we will still need to provide solutions to make our farmers profitable, economically viable, but also that they are willing to invest, because there is a lot of risk of changing these practices. Not only risk, but also there is a cultural shift. So this will come with different benefits that if we sustain the soil as the core component to be restored, there will be other incorporations like carbon sequestration, like water reduction, and different social economic benefits as well, and biodiversity topics as well. But here also we have a business case. So while moving this, and this is when I talk, we usually, one of the main concerns that we had when we talk about TNFD, disclosures, is that we usually tend to see this as a compliance topic and not as an opportunity to change and transition and take the opportunities that are ahead. So what we're seeing that today, for example, we are delivering services, products to 340 million acres. With regenerative agriculture, we see a potential to move to 400 million acres. And that's where we see. And usually, these technologies and different products and services would be in regions that they need to advance in this concern. Usually, I've seen also this type of approach. I had a misconception, for example, that, for example, this is not for smallholder farmers. I've been in Kenya this January, and farmers in the middle of nowhere, with not even accessible products to produce what they need to feed themselves, they were talking about regenerative agriculture. They were talking about the principles and practices that they need to implement, but they need the support, they need the financing. And one person said, if I can do no tillage, that will reduce the labor costs, and with those costs less on my production, I can send my kids to school. And sounds very storytelling, but when you see the reality of those smallholder farmers, these change of practices are a radical change. So in Africa, that 1940 amount of land that it was needed to the future, they're already 1980s, how they're producing. So there is a lot of opportunities on that end. How that also relates into our business case, today we're providing a business of inputs, of crop protection and seed and traits of around 100 billion. Where we advance on what we call agents in markets, we're talking about how we can integrate precision applications. How do we do marketplaces where people can access more of the product? What are the digital platforms advancing into areas that we have not been able to access before? How do we develop the carbon market programs? How do we improve crop fertility with microbiotics that you will not need to fertilize that much more? Or how do we stand on biofuels? So we started working, and these are a couple of results that, for example, in a farmer that have started to implement these practices, so we were talking about on operations, 1,600 sites, up to going into your supply chain and then moving even into downstream, the impact of downstream, it's enormous, and it's far much bigger of what it can happen if you only focus on your own operations, and that's what these frameworks are aiming for. And in this farmer, for example, you see that in a 3-year crop rotation, they have gained productivity of additional 13%, they have improved their gross profit by 20%, but at the same time that they have been doing that, they have been increasing the biomass, so 65 improvement in carbon balance, which accounts also for 1.5 carbon equivalent sequestration per hectare. And of course, this also comes with less spray of crop protection and fertilizer, which also requires that us rethink the market that we will be working on. So that transition is what I like to see, that at the end, we will be moving the way that Bayer will start to do a different type of businesses and a different approach. And at the end, if I would like to wrap up in one sentence, so ESG, it's about compliance, but if we do it from the business transition, it's just about showing our business. So it's not about doing the compliance, it's about aligning your business with long-term sustainability goals. Thank you.